The dust in redemption was a fine red powder, the ground-down bones of the mountain and the hopes of the men who'd tunneled into it. It settled on everything, a shroud of rust-colored grief. On the warped plank of the general store's porch, on the rheumy eyes of the dog that lay dying in the sliver of shade cast by the gallows, on the soul of Gideon Varn. He felt it coat his tongue, taste of iron and endings. The town was a corpse, picked clean by lean years and the railroad's decision to swerve south. Its ribs, the sun-bleached skeletons of half-built homes, stood stark against a sky the color of a faded bruise. The only sound was the fretful whine of the wind worrying the loose board on the abandoned assay office, a lonely, persistent complaint. Gideon had come here to disappear, to let the last embers of his own story grow cold. He was a man made of scarred leather and silence, his face a roadmap of hard miles and harder bargains, his eyes the color of a washed-out winter sky. He'd been a scout once, had a name whispered with a certain kind of reverence in places where maps were lies and the land itself was the only truth. He'd known the tongue of the Setsehestahis, the Cheyenne, and the crackle of a signal fire on a distant mesa. He'd known the weight of an army-issue Colt and the heavier weight of the silver dollars paid for his knowledge, for his silence. Coin that felt cold in his hand even on the hottest day, a chill that had sunk down into his bones and never left. He saw her then, a flicker of motion against the unyielding glare of the afternoon. She was chained to the hitching post in front of what was once the saloon, now just a hollow-eyed shell with swinging doors that beat a frantic, uneven rhythm in the wind. A slate board hung crookedly from a nail above her head, the chalk words blurred but legible. Thief, bread. She was little more than a girl, a tangle of black hair and bones sharp enough to cut the cloth of her threadbare dress. Her wrists, where the iron cuff was clasped, were rubbed raw, the skin broken and dark with dried blood. She didn't strain against the chain. She stood with a stillness that was unnerving, a small, defiant landmark in the vast emptiness of the street. Her face was smudged with dirt, but her eyes were ancient. They held the vast, unforgiving expanse of the plains, the knowledge of things no child should know. They were not broken. They were watching, waiting. Gideon's hand, resting on the worn grip of the knife at his belt, twitched. He'd made a life of looking away. It was the first rule of survival, the one that kept the coin coming and the ghosts at bay. Look away from the faces in the flames. Look away from the blue-coated soldiers taking their trophies. Look away from the women wailing in the snow. He'd been paid to guide them, to lead them to the quiet winter camp on the Big Sandy Creek, a place he knew was supposed to be safe, a place under the promise of a flag. He'd taken the silver and ridden north, the smoke a smudge on the horizon behind him, the screams swallowed by the wind. He tried to look away now. He focused on the saloon's swinging doors, on the dust devils dancing in the street, on the buzz of a fat green fly. But his gaze was a traitor, drawn back to the girl, to the raw red line on her wrist, to the terrible knowing stillness in her eyes. It was the same stillness he'd seen in the eyes of a doe just before the rifle's crack, a stillness that was not surrender, but an acknowledgement of the inevitable. He walked toward her, his boots scuffing a soft protest from the dust. The dying dog lifted its head, offered a feeble, ragged bark, then laid its head back on its paws. The wind gusted, sending a tumbleweed rolling past them like a lost and weary traveler. He stopped in front of her. She didn't flinch, didn't beg. She just watched him, her dark eyes reflecting his own grizzled, broken image. He'd never cut a chain meant to bind a child for the crime of hunger. He looked back at the girl. Her eyes. They knew too much. They knew about smoke and screams and the cold feel of betrayal. He could see it in their depths, a reflection of a horror he'd spent a decade trying to outrun. He saw the winter camp on the Big Sandy. He saw the white flag of truce fluttering beside the stars and stripes. He saw the charge of the 100 Dazers, the third Colorado, their faces contorted with a righteous fury he'd helped to aim. The storekeeper took a step forward. "I'm warning you. This ain't your affair." Gideon drew his knife. The blade was long and clean, its edge honed to a razor's sharpness. It caught the afternoon sun, threw a sliver of blinding light into the storekeeper's eyes. "Everything's my affair," Gideon said, and the words felt strange and true in his mouth. He knelt in the dust before the girl. He didn't touch her. He simply held the knife up, showing her the blade. Her eyes, for the first time, showed a flicker of something other than watchful endurance. It might have been fear. It might have been hope. He turned his attention to the chain where it was looped through the iron ring of the shackle. It was thick, but the links were old, rusted. He wedged the tip of his knife into the crevice of a link, found his purchase, and with a grunt, twisted his wrist. The iron groaned, resisted. The storekeeper shouted something, a blustering threat that dissolved in the wind. Gideon ignored it. He put his weight into it, the muscles in his arm and back cording. The metal shrieked, a high, thin sound of protest, and then, with a sharp crack that echoed down the empty street, the link snapped. The chain fell away, slithering into the dust like a dead snake. The girl didn't move. She stood there, her wrist still held as if the shackle were there. A line of bright blood welled up where the iron had scraped her as it fell. Gideon rose slowly. He didn't look at the storekeeper, who was fumbling with a shotgun inside the doorway of his store. He looked at the girl. "Come on," he said, his voice softer than he intended. He turned and walked, not looking back to see if she was following. He walked past the gallows, past the dying dog, his steps steady and unhurried. He was halfway down the street when he heard the soft fall of bare feet in the dust behind him. She was there. The land they moved through was a wounded thing. The sun had baked the earth into a cracked ochre scab, and the wind, a ceaseless mourner, whispered through the skeletons of cottonwoods that lined the dry creek beds. They walked for hours, Gideon setting a slow, steady pace, the girl trailing a few feet behind him, a silent shadow. She moved with an economy of motion he recognized, the gait of one who had walked long distances, who knew how to conserve strength. He didn't ask her questions. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the hum of the heat and the vast, aching loneliness of the landscape. It was a silence he understood. Words were currency for a world he'd left behind. Out here, you listened to the land, to the scuttling of a lizard, to the cry of a hawk circling in the thermal updrafts. You listened to what wasn't said. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the western sky, he found a small overhang of rock, a shallow cave carved by wind and time. It would offer some shelter. He built a small fire, the flames grasping at the dry sticks with a hungry crackle. The girl watched him, her dark eyes reflecting the dancing light. He took a piece of jerky from his satchel and a canteen of water, setting them on the ground between them. She looked at the food, then at him. He gave a short, sharp nod. She took the jerky, her small fingers closing around it, and began to chew with a slow, deliberate intensity, as if relearning the act of eating. He watched her, the firelight casting flickering shadows across her face. He could see the markings more clearly now. They were not fresh, but old. The lines faded to a faint, silvery tracery against her sun-darkened skin. Just below the hollow of her throat, the star. It was a simple shape, four-pointed, like the ones he'd seen sewn in beads on a warrior's moccasins. Wo Hai Hev, the morning star, a symbol of hope, of guidance, a new day, and beneath it, running down toward her sternum, the other marks, not tears. He saw it now, a line of tiny, meticulously rendered figures, horses, unmistakably horses, their legs bent as if in full gallop, one after another, a desperate flight, and beside them, smaller, almost indistinguishable marks. He had to squint to see them, figures, running and falling. His heart, a cold, hard knot in his chest, tightened. It was a ledger, a story etched not on a hide or the page of a stolen book, but on her own skin. A story of a flight, of a massacre. The land was stirring echoes. As the fire crackled, the whisper of the wind through the sagebrush began to sound like voices. The murmur of a camp settling in for the night, the cry of a baby, the low song of a woman grinding corn. He closed his eyes, but the images were there, burned onto the backs of his eyelids. The lodges of Black Kettle's people nestled in the bend of the Big Sandy. The smell of wood smoke and roasting meat. The laughter of children playing with dogs in the thin winter sun. He had led them there. He had pointed the way. A safe place, the colonel had said, his voice smooth as whiskey. A place for the peaceful ones to wait out the war. And Gideon, who knew the colonel's thirst for glory was as vast and empty as the plains themselves, had taken the silver and drawn the map. He opened his eyes. The girl had finished the jerky and was sipping the water, her gaze fixed on the fire. He had cut her free, but what had he freed her to? A world that had already tried to kill her, that had written its brutality on her body. He had not freed her. He had simply made her his responsibility. The thought settled on him with a familiar, suffocating weight. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat with his back against the rock, his rifle across his lap, and listened to the sounds of the night. The yip of a distant coyote, the soft hoot of an owl. Each sound was a thread in the tapestry of the darkness, a reminder of the life that persisted in this harsh, unforgiving world. And with each sound, the echoes in his own mind grew louder. He remembered the names of the men he'd ridden with in the 3rd, bolder men mostly, farmers and miners, their hands soft from city living, eager to play soldier, to earn the 100-day enlistment bonus. Men who'd boasted in the saloons of Denver about the Indian problem. He remembered a young lieutenant, Silas Soule, a man with honest eyes, who had argued with Chivington, who had called it murder before it even began. A man whose company had refused to fire. Soule was dead now, shot in the back on a Denver street not long after he testified against the colonel. Justice on the frontier. The girl slept fitfully, a small whimper escaping her lips now and then. He wondered what stories her dreams told her. Did she see the soldiers charging at dawn, their faces pale and monstrous in the cold morning light? Did she hear the thunder of the howitzers, the splintering of lodgepoles, the screams that the wind could not carry away? He looked at the markings on her chest, visible in the faint glow of the dying embers. A story of survival, but also a brand, a testament to what she had lost. He had helped erase that story once, for a handful of silver and the promise of being left alone. Now it was written on the flesh of the child sleeping beside him. The next days fell into a rhythm. They walked from sunup to sundown, moving ever northward. Gideon knew the land, knew where to find the hidden seeps of water, the small pockets of game. He taught her, without words, how to read the signs, how to find the wild onions hiding at the base of a rock, how to set a snare for a rabbit. She was a quick study, her hands deft, her eyes missing nothing. She still did not speak. But she began to communicate in other ways. A touch on his arm to point out the distant shimmer of an antelope herd. A small, intricately woven ring of grass left by the fire for him in the morning. And one evening, as he was cleaning a rabbit for their meal, she took a charred stick from the fire and began to draw in the dirt. The lines were hesitant at first, then grew surer. She drew the hitching post, the chain. She drew a large, bloated figure and a smaller figure with a knife. Then she drew the two of them, walking, and then she drew the star on her own chest, the morning star. She pointed to it, then pointed north. He understood. She was not just wandering. She had a destination. The north, the land of the northern Cheyenne, of the Tongue River, a homeland, a place of belonging. It was a journey of 1,000 miles, a journey through hostile territory, through a world that wanted her dead or broken. His own journey was supposed to have ended in the dust of that dying town. He had sought oblivion, a quiet fading into nothing. But the girl, with her silent story and her unwavering gaze, had lit a different path. It was a path that led not into forgetting, but into memory. It led back to the Big Sandy. As they traveled, the land began to change. The flat plains gave way to rolling hills, dotted with pinyon and juniper. The air grew thinner, cleaner, and the echoes grew stronger. He saw things that weren't there. A flash of blue among the trees that became a soldier's coat, the glint of sun on a rock that became a cavalry saber. He found himself scanning the ridgelines, not for game, but for patrols. The past was not behind him. It was all around him, a living, breathing thing. One afternoon, they came upon a place where the earth was scarred, a series of shallow depressions and overgrown trenches running along the banks of a dried-up creek. The trees here were old, their bark blackened on one side, as if from a fire long ago. A strange stillness hung in the air, a silence that was heavier than the absence of sound. Gideon stopped. He knew this place. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was it, the creek bend, the site of the camp, the place he had delivered to the butcher. The girl seemed to feel it too. She stopped beside him, her small hand reaching out, not to touch him, but as if to feel the texture of the air itself. She walked slowly toward the creek bed, to the shallow pits where the people had tried to dig for cover. She knelt, her fingers tracing the edge of one of the depressions. He could see it all, the chaos of the dawn attack, the warriors, hopelessly outnumbered, trying to form a line of defense, the women and children scrambling for shelter in these hastily dug pits, the soldiers firing down into them, the howitzers lobbing shells. He remembered the smell of gunpowder and blood, a thick, sickening miasma that clung to the cold air. He remembered the triumphant yells of the soldiers, the high-pitched screams of the dying. He had not been here for the killing. He had taken his money and ridden away. But his betrayal had been the key that unlocked the slaughterhouse door. His silence had been the grease on the wheels of the cannons. He felt a hand on his arm. It was the girl. She was looking at him, her eyes wide, and in them he saw not accusation, but a shared and terrible understanding. She pointed to the ground, to a small, dark object half buried in the earth. He knelt and dug it out with his fingers. It was a bead, a single blue trade bead, the kind the women used to decorate their dresses and cradleboards. He sat and let the ghosts claim him, let their silent accusations strip him bare. Little Bird moved quietly about, gathering berries, finding water. She left them for him, but did not press him to take them. She was giving him the space to drown. On the third morning, as the first light of dawn touched the eastern sky, she came to him. She held out her hand. In it was a single, perfect eagle feather she had found by the creek. She laid it gently on the ground before him. Then she picked up his canteen, filled it, and brought it to his lips. "We go," she said. Not a question, a statement. He drank. The water was cool and clean, and it felt like absolution. He looked at her, at this small, fierce child who had survived the unthinkable, who had carried the story of her people on her own small body. He had set her free from a chain, but she, in her turn, was setting him free from a prison of his own making. The prison of his silence. He got to his feet. His body ached, but his spirit, scoured clean by grief, felt strangely light. The echoes were still there, but they were no longer a torment. They were a chorus, a reminder, a purpose. He would not just get her north. He would see her home. He would be the bridge. The journey north was a long, slow unwinding. The land grew harsher, more beautiful. They crossed wide, empty basins where the wind blew relentlessly, and climbed into high, broken country where the mountains clawed at the sky. They saw no one for weeks at a time. The world seemed to have been wiped clean, leaving only the two of them and the vast, indifferent landscape. Gideon taught Little Bird everything he knew: how to track a deer, how to read the clouds, how to find north by the stars. He taught her the names of the plants, the calls of the birds. And as he taught her, he found himself remembering who he had been before the silver, before the betrayal. The man who had loved the wildness of this land, who had respected the people who knew its secrets. She, in turn, taught him. She showed him the quiet language of the Cheyenne, the subtle gestures, the way a story could be told in the flicker of an eye, the turn of a hand. She told him the stories behind the marks on the ledger tree, stories her mother had told her, stories of courage and loss, of ceremony and laughter. She was repiecing her world, and in doing so, she was repiecing him. One night, sitting by the fire, she pointed to the star on her chest. "Vohehev," she said. "My father saw it in a dream. He said it would guide me. He died in the creek." Gideon looked into the flames, his heart a dull ache in his chest. He was right. They were in the high country, the land of pine and shadow, when they ran into trouble. It came not in the form of soldiers, but of fur trappers. 3 of them, bearded and greasy, their eyes small and hard. They smelled of whiskey and greed. They saw Gideon's rifle, the pack on his back, and the girl standing behind him. "Well now," the leader said, spitting a brown stream of tobacco juice. "Look what we got here, an old man and his squaw." Gideon felt a cold, familiar calm settle over him. He stepped in front of Little Bird, his hand resting on the butt of his pistol. "Keep riding." The trappers laughed. "We ain't going nowhere. That's a Cheyenne girl, ain't she? Worth something, a girl like that. Or we could just have some fun." The world narrowed to the space between them. Gideon saw the flicker of the man's eyes as he glanced at his companions, saw the slight tensing of his hand as it moved toward his own gun. Time slowed down. The wind died. The only sound was the thudding of his own heart. He drew and fired in one fluid motion. The shot was deafening in the mountain silence. The lead trapper grunted, a look of surprise on his face, and crumpled to the ground. The other 2, stunned, fumbled for their weapons. Gideon's second shot took one in the chest. The third man, his nerve broken, turned to run, but Little Bird was already moving. She had snatched Gideon's heavy knife from his belt, and she threw it with a fierce, desperate strength. The blade buried itself in the fleeing man's back. He screamed, a thin, ugly sound, and fell face first into the pine needles. Silence returned, thick and heavy. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air. Gideon looked at Little Bird. She stood, trembling, her face pale, her eyes wide with the shock of what she had done. He walked to her, retrieved his knife, and wiped it clean on the dead man's shirt. He handed it back to her, hilt first. "You survived," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "That's all that matters." She took the knife, her small hand closing around the familiar bone handle. She looked at the dead men, then at him, and in her eyes he saw the last of the child flicker and die, replaced by the hard, unyielding steel of the woman she was forced to become. They did not speak of it again. But something had shifted between them. They were no longer just a man and a child. They were partners, survivors, bound together by the blood they had spilled. Weeks later, they finally reached the Tongue River. The land here was green and lush, the river a wide silver ribbon winding through the valley. It was the homeland. Gideon could feel it in the air, a sense of peace, of belonging, that he had not felt in years. They found the Cheyenne camp nestled in a grove of cottonwoods. The lodges were painted with the symbols of family histories, of great deeds, of powerful visions. The smell of wood smoke and cooking meat filled the air. Children's laughter echoed through the trees. It was a world away from the dust and death of redemption. As they approached, people emerged from the lodges, their faces curious, wary. They saw the grizzled white man and the thin, ragged girl with the markings on her skin. An old woman, her face a beautiful mask of wrinkles, stepped forward. Her eyes fell on the star on Little Bird's chest, and a look of stunned recognition crossed her face. "Na nesheto," she whispered, her voice trembling. Little Bird looked at the woman, and her face, for the first time since he had known her, seemed to soften, to crumble. A single tear traced a clean path through the dirt on her cheek. "Eshki," she breathed. "Grandmother." The old woman rushed forward and gathered the girl into her arms, weeping, murmuring her name over and over. Other people came, surrounding them, touching Little Bird's hair, her face, welcoming the lost one home. Gideon stood back, his heart a painful, joyous knot in his chest. He had done it. He had brought her home. His part in this story was over. He turned to leave, to slip away into the shadows as he always had. But Little Bird pulled away from her grandmother and ran to him. She grabbed his hand, her grip surprisingly strong. "No," she said, her voice firm, clear. "You stay." He looked down at her, at this impossible child who had walked out of the ashes of his past to save him from himself. He looked at her people, their faces now turned toward him, no longer with suspicion, but with a kind of questioning gratitude. He looked at the land, at the river, at the sky. He was home, too. In a way he had never expected. He stayed. He lived in the shadow of the camp, a quiet, watchful presence. He never fully belonged, but he was not an outcast. He was the man who had brought Little Bird home. That was his name. That was his story. Years passed. The lines on Gideon's face deepened. His hair turned white as the winter snow. He watched Little Bird grow into a strong, proud woman, her eyes holding the wisdom of her ancestors and the fire of her own spirit. He saw her marry a young warrior, saw her hold her own children, telling them the stories of the people, the story of the star, the story of the long walk north. The echoes in his own soul never fully faded. The ghosts of the Big Sandy were always with him. But they were no longer his tormentors. They were his companions, a reminder of the price of silence and the cost of redemption. One spring, a sickness came to the camp, a fever that burned hot and fast, brought by the white man's world. It took the old and the young. Little Bird's youngest son fell ill. The medicine man's herbs and prayers did nothing. The boy was fading. Gideon knew the sickness. He had seen it in the army camps, and he knew the only thing that could sometimes break the fever was quinine, a bitter white powder he had once carried in his saddlebags. A powder that could only be found at the trading posts, a day's hard ride to the south. He went to Little Bird. She was kneeling by her son's sleeping mat, her face etched with a desperate, helpless grief. "I can get medicine," he said. She looked up at him, her eyes full of a pain that mirrored his own from so long ago. "The trappers, the soldiers, I know," he said. He placed his hand on her shoulder, a rare gesture of affection. "It's all right." He rode south. The land that had once been his escape was now his enemy. He rode hard, his old bones protesting, his heart a steady, determined drumbeat. He reached the trading post, a dirty, fly-blown place at a crossroads. He got the quinine, paying for it with the last of his old silver dollars, the coin feeling cold and heavy in his hand for the last time. He was riding back, the precious medicine wrapped safely in his saddlebag, when they found him. A patrol of young, eager soldiers, their faces clean-shaven, their blue uniforms crisp and new. They saw an old white man, dressed in buckskin, riding from the direction of the Cheyenne reservation. To them, he was a traitor, an accomplice. "Hold it right there, old man," the sergeant said, his voice full of a young man's arrogance. Gideon reined in his horse. He knew this was the end of the trail. There would be no escape this time. He looked back to the north, toward the Tongue River, toward the camp, toward Little Bird. He thought of the bridge she had been denied. The bridge between her past and her future, the one the massacre had tried to burn. He had spent his life burning bridges. Now, he would become one. He spurred his horse, not away from the soldiers, but toward them. He let out a yell, a Cheyenne war cry he hadn't uttered in 30 years. It was a cry of defiance, of grief, of love. The soldiers, startled, raised their rifles. The volley of shots echoed through the hills. Gideon felt the impact, a series of hard, brutal blows that knocked the breath from his body. He fell from his horse, his eyes on the northern sky. The last thing he saw was a single hawk circling high above, its wings spread wide against the endless blue. His body was the bridge, a bridge of bone and blood, offered up in payment for a debt he could never truly repay. A bridge that would allow a little boy to live, a mother to smile, a people to endure. A bridge that would carry a story, not of a scout who had betrayed his soul for coin, but of a man who had, at the end, offered his body as the price for breaking a chain, and in doing so had finally and forever set himself free.